welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Muriel Banakisa and I'm a food photographer, recipe developer, and content creator. On this channel, I love to talk about food photography, and more specifically today, we're going to be talking about how to shoot food photos on colorful backdrops. I know sometimes it can be kind of tricky to shoot on colorful backdrops just because of the fact that they are colorful and that color can sometimes compete with the color of your main dish that you're shooting or your ingredient. But today I want to share with you a couple of tips and tricks on how I personally go about shooting on colorful backdrops. I'll touch a little bit on some color theory as well as share with you some of my personal picks in terms of colors that I like to work with and that work well in a variety of different scenarios. So if you're interested in this topic, make sure to watch this video from beginning to the end. Before sharing with you some actionable tips and tricks on how to use colorful backdrops in your photography, I think it's really important for us to understand a little bit more color theory. So color theory includes a set of rules and guidelines that explain how the human eye interprets colors and how mixing and matching colors together can have different effects. In color theories, all colors are divided in three categories. So you have primary colors, secondary colors, and tertiary colors. The primary colors include blue, yellow, and red, and the secondary colors include green, purple, and orange. Tertiary colors include colors that are made of primary colors and secondary colors together. So those would include, for example, blue-green or yellow-green or orangey-yellow. So all three types of colors can be found on what is called a color wheel. And on this color wheel, you can tell that there is blue, yellow, red, orange, purple, and green, as well as all the colors that would be in between. Color theory also includes this concept of color harmony, which means that certain colors, when put together, look more harmonious. And within that umbrella of color harmony, there are two other concepts that I personally love to use in my food photography, and more specifically when I'm shooting on colorful backdrops. And those two concepts are analogous colors and complementary colors. In order to understand these concepts, I think it's really important to look at the color wheel. Let's start off with analogous colors. Analogous colors are colors that find themselves near each other on the color wheel. As you can tell on this color wheel, the green is near the green-yellow as well as near the yellow. And so how do you apply analogous colors into your food photography? For me personally, I love to use analogous colors when I shoot with vegetables or fruits that are a similar color to my backdrop. For example, if I am playing around with a green backdrop, I can place some limes on the backdrop and they will naturally look beautiful. Because of the fact that the backdrop is green, the limes have some green and also some yellow green, and even sometimes just a touch of yellow, and all these colors will just look harmonious together and the photo will be beautiful. When it comes now to complementary colors, I think it's a concept that a lot more people are familiar with or they've at least heard in the past. But basically what complementary colors are colors that find themselves opposite of each other on the color wheel. So for example, if you look at this color wheel, you can tell that yellow and blue are on opposite ends and green and red are on opposite ends as well. So what this means more practically when it comes to shooting food photography is that if you want to create an image that is harmonious, you can pick two colors on the color wheel and use them in your scene and they will look harmonious together. And this is something that I personally use all the time in my photography. For example, I have tons of images that are shot on the blue backdrop and the main subject is yellow or orange. Like for example, in the case of this Thai pumpkin soup. Because the two colors are opposite on the color wheel, when put together in one image, the image just looks harmonious. In order to illustrate my point a little further, I think it would be really helpful if we took a look at other images that I have created using this concept of color harmony. The first example that I want to share with you is this example of nutritional yeast coated tofu. This image was shot very intentionally. I really wanted to play with the concept of complementary colors, and so I chose a backdrop that has a little bit of a bluish green color to it, and I purposefully chose accessories that are pink in order to complement that green color. Because if you look on the color wheel, green and pink are kind of like on opposite ends. So I knew that, and therefore I chose the backdrop and the accessories in order for those colors to work well together and to look harmonious to the eye. Here's an example of using the concept of analogous colors in order to create harmony in a photo. In this case, I purposefully chose a backdrop that was blue in color to shoot these bluish grapes on. And the reason why I did that is because I wanted to create an image that had lots of variations of blues. So from light blues in the back of the image to darker blues in the foreground, all those blues together kind of create a harmonious image and one that is very pleasing to look at. Of course, this is not to say that if I had chosen to put my grapes in a red bowl, the image wouldn't have been successful. As I've mentioned in other videos in the past, there's no such thing as rules that are set in stone. Yes, of course, color theory is super helpful in guiding us how to choose certain colors to create a more harmonious image, but by no means those are rules that you can't break ever. I think it's important when you do food photography or just photography in general to find your own voice and your aesthetic, and sometimes to break certain rules and to play around and see what is successful and what is less successful. So this video is simply to help you guys who are interested in maybe understanding a little bit more about color theory and how to implement that in your food photography. Now that we've covered the more theoretical aspect of this video, I want to jump into some tips and tricks that you can use when you are actually shooting with colorful backdrops, and also some tips and tricks on how to actually go about and choosing which colored backdrops you should invest in. Tip number one is choose backdrops that have similar colors to foods that you like to shoot with. For example, I personally love my pink backdrops and my green backdrop. The reason why is because there are so many foods in nature that have green colors or red, pinkish colors. In the case of my pink backdrops, for example, I've used them in so many different setups when I was shooting with berries or pomegranates or any really red fruit. So for example, in this image, I bought this purple cauliflower and I thought, okay, how do I make it shine? How do I bring out the beauty of that color? And I thought of using my pink backdrop because, as you can tell on the color wheel, purple is right next to pink, and therefore I knew that by putting my purple cauliflower on this pink surface, it would create a sense of harmony. An important thing to remember is that if you are shooting with colorful backdrops and using the concept of analogous colors, it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have all the elements being analogous to each other on the color wheel. For example, I wouldn't expect you to shoot like this red velvet cake topped with berries on a pink backdrop. Of course, it would look beautiful, I think, but it's not necessary. I think as long as you have a certain sense of repetition of colors, you will have that same sense of harmony. For example, in this photo of this berry cake, I didn't use a colorful backdrop, but I think I can illustrate my point quite clearly. Because I was shooting with red berries, I thought, why not repeat that pink color in the pink napkin as well? And that again creates this sense of harmony. Of course, I could have shot this cake on a pink backdrop and it would have reinforced this sense of harmony and created even more repetition in the scene, making the image more visually pleasing. Another color of backdrops that I personally love to play with is green backdrops. Because there are so many veggies and even fruits that are green, I think green backdrops work beautifully in many different scenarios, whether you're shooting a photo using the concept of analogous colors, like I mentioned before with the lime example, or if you're shooting a photo with complementary colors. So let's say if you were shooting a purple cauliflower on a green backdrop, I think it would look kind of funky, but also kind of good because green and purple are complementary colors and they look really nice when they're paired together. Tip number two to shooting with colorful backdrops is choose backdrops that don't have too much saturation to them. And what I mean by this is if you had the option to choose between a bright red backdrop vs a darker red, almost like wine-colored backdrop, I personally suggest going with the darker red one. The reason for that is because of the fact that that one has less saturation. What that does is that it will just make it easier for you when it comes time to shooting to work with a backdrop that has a little bit less color, because it's going to compete a little less with your food. At the end of the day, the backdrop is really important, but it shouldn't, generally speaking, it shouldn't be the main subject of your photography. If you're doing food photography, the food needs to be the main focus. So going with backdrops that have a little bit less saturation in them will just make it easier for you to use those backdrops in a variety of different scenarios, and also will just make it easier for you to bring the attention to your main subject, which will be the food, as opposed to take attention away from the food and bring it to the backdrop. This is not to say that colorful backdrops should never be purchased and never have a place in food photography. Of course they do. I think there are different scenarios where you could want or need a more colorful backdrop. However, if you're at the beginning stages of building your backdrop collection, I think starting off with backdrops that are a little less saturated will just make it easier for you to use them in a variety of different scenarios and to be more successful in terms of bringing the attention to the main subject, which is the food. Tip number 3 to shooting with colorful backdrops is choose backdrops that have texture. This tip links back a little bit to the video that I had made about backdrops. If you haven't seen it, you can click up here. In that video, I talked all about the different backdrops that I have in my collection, from vinyls to wooden backdrops and ceramic tiles. When it comes to choosing colorful backdrops to use in your food photography, one thing to keep in mind is to prioritize backdrops that have some texture to them. Whether you're shooting on vinyl or on wood, I think texture in backdrops in general tends to add a little bit of visual interest to your backdrop, adds a little bit of depth. That texture could be printed on the backdrop if it's in the case of a vinyl, or it could be actually applied onto it if it's a backdrop that you made yourself or a backdrop that you've purchased from a backdrop company. In my personal food photography, when I shoot with colorful backdrops, I do tend to gravitate with backdrops that have a lot of texture to them. If you've seen some of my other photography, you know that for some client work, I do use sometimes just plain posters or just single colored backdrops. Those type of backdrops can also work well in food photography, but in my case, I personally tend to gravitate towards those types of backdrops when I do more commercial work, just because I find with the type of photography that I do for myself, I like to have backdrops that have a little bit more texture and like dimension, because it feels a little bit more natural and a little less commercial. Again, this is not to say that if you're shooting for yourself, you can't be using posters or like single colored backdrops. I know photographers that do that and they have amazing effects. It's just generally speaking, I don't tend to gravitate towards that. That's not as much my style. Fourth and final tip to shooting on colorful backdrop is use Lightroom. Lightroom is your friend. Basically what I mean by this is that you can really use the power of Lightroom to help you play with the colors of your backdrops. In order to illustrate this point, let's jump into Lightroom and I'll show you exactly how I play with the hue panel in the program in order to tweak the colors of my backdrop to achieve the harmony that I'm looking for. So we're now in Lightroom. I picked out 2 photos that were shot on a colorful backdrops. These images are both images that I created for a client, and as you can tell, they're already both edited. So let's play a little bit with the hue of these backdrops. In order to do that, you just have to go to this little panel here, HSL or Hue Saturation Luminance. If you watched my videos before, you know I love to spend time right here on Lightroom. So you just open that up, and here my backdrop, as you can tell, is a little bit pinkish. So you want to select the magenta color. I'm already on it, but you just have to select the color of your backdrop. If you are working with, let's say, a green backdrop, you just click on the green. I personally chose the pink backdrop to be this light pinkish color. However, I could definitely play around with it a little bit so that the color comes out a little bit more purplish or a little bit more reddish. And in order to do that, all you have to do is just play with the hue slider. So let's say right now it's at 51. Let's say I bring it to the other end completely towards the purple. See how the whole backdrop changes its hue? It goes from being more of a pink to being more of a purple. And let's say if I drag it all the way to the other side towards the red, you'll see that the backdrop will become closer to a reddish color. Of course, the variation can't be crazy big because you are just playing with the hue of the color and not actually changing the color itself. Like, you're not making this backdrop yellow or like green. You're really just playing with, if you want it in this case to be purple or red. But this could be really fun because it just means that you have a little bit of flexibility in terms of the hue of your backdrop. And if, let's say, you wanted this backdrop to be a little bit more colorful and have more saturation, again, you can play with the saturation right here and make the pink be very, very pink and intense, or you can take it away completely, which, I mean, it's not great, but let's say you wanted to do that, you definitely can. That is an option that is available to you. And now let's look at another example. This is an image that was shot, as you can tell, on a blue backdrop. Again, we can do the same thing and head over to the hue, saturation, and luminance panel. We'll click on the blue and we'll play with the hue, dragging it first towards the aqua. And you can see all the blues turn into more of an aqua color. And then if you would bring it to the other side, it's going to be closer to like a purple. I personally, in that case, really like the kind of in between. It was very close to the initial blue of the backdrop, which I already liked and found worked really well in this scene. And again, you can play with the saturation, make the blue more intense, less saturated. This is really, you know, up to you to find that perfect balance and what works best for you. All in all, this is simply to illustrate that even once you have captured an image on a colorful backdrop, you can still have a little bit of flexibility to play with that color and change the hue and the saturation of it in post-production. Well, that's it, you guys. I really hope you enjoyed this video and you learned something new. I would love to know in the comments below if you like to shoot with colorful backdrops, and if so, what are your go-to colors? And if you don't already shoot with colorful backdrops, is that something you're considering to do in the future? If so, what will be your first colorful backdrop that you purchase or make? And on that note, make sure to give this video a thumbs up, subscribe, share if you want to, and thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you very soon.